And so just a reminder, I'm not an expert in this, but it's been a lot of fun for me to sort of read about all this work and try to put it together for you this morning. So one of the cool, I think, interesting things about fire in general is sort of its history in on the planet. And so just going to start out giving you sort of a very quick tutorial on what fire is, how it starts and is maintained, and its importance to us as a human species. It's really a fascinating story how important fire is to us as humans. We've actually, as I'll talk about, evolved to require the presence of fire for land management and for cooking and for food acquisition. So fires, most fire departments, if you go and they tell you about what you need to understand about fire, they show you this fire triangle, or this is the fire tetrad. But basically, there's three ingredients that you need to have fire. You need oxygen, you need a fuel, and then you need heat or a spark to initiate what then becomes a self-sustaining chemical reaction. And fire is really in underlying it all. It's just like electricity. Basically, electrons flow like through a wire. The fuel stores all the electrons. Oxygen is low in it. So the electrons flow from the fuel to the oxygen, give off enormous amounts of energy. And so that is what leads then to the self-sustaining aspects and the fact that it's so catastrophic in many ways, particularly in a wildfire perspective. So the interesting thing about fire on Earth, we take it for granted now that fire is with us. We have to prevent it. We have to manage it. But it's only been possible really in the last, well, 1/9 of Earth's history, because for the first 8/9 of Earth's history, there wasn't enough oxygen, and there wasn't any fuel. So it's a long kind of interesting history of the evolution of our cosmos that got us to the point where we have fire. So this is the most complicated diagram I'm going to show this morning. This on the bottom here is sort of the timeline of the Earth from 4.5 billion years ago up to where we are today. So the first 4 billion years was a planet without fire, and it only happened because maybe about 2 billion years ago, some bacteria acquired the ability to photosynthesize, and then they started adding oxygen to the atmosphere. And it took a couple billion years before oxygen actually built up in the atmosphere to levels that are close to what we have today. And then that ultimately led to the formation of the ozone layer around the planet. And when the ozone layer formed, it basically blocked out all this really negative UV radiation and other radiation. And that allowed plants to move onto land. And so the accumulation of oxygen allowed plants to evolve and move on land. So about 500 million years ago, we had all the right combinations for fire to start. And so fire history on Earth started around 500 million years ago. So this is sort of a diagram of wildfire history from 500 million years ago up to the present. And so for a long time, people weren't part of the picture. There were vast spikes in wildfire 400 million years ago when atmospheric oxygen really went to high levels, over 30%. We're at about 19% now. It almost caused spontaneous combustion at that point. And then fire sort of settled down for a long time into a steady pace. Scientists know about or estimate fire frequency from basically charcoal found in coal beds around the world. So they can kind of estimate relative changes in fire history over time. But the big change in fire trajectory on Earth began less than 1 million years ago, when humans and our ancestors showed up on the scene. About 1 million years ago, some of our ancient ancestors started to be able to take wildfire, maintain it, manage it, and start to use it as a tool to basically not only cook food, but to manage the landscape. And then with our knowledge and tool set, fire frequency started to increase and reached a relatively high level that lasted over tens or even hundreds of thousands of years. People in Africa, Asia, Europe, the New World were essentially burning and managing vast areas of the landscape using wildfire techniques to open up landscapes for hunting, remove predators, basically make life better for themselves. So we were a lot. We've had 100,000, 200,000 year history as a species of basically using fire and increasing fire frequency on Earth. And then about 500 years ago, there was a dip. Well, beginning a little earlier, when we adopted agriculture, fire frequency went down a little bit because farmers didn't burn things, they just tilled the soil. And then globally, there was a huge drop in fire frequency about 500 years ago when Columbus landed in the New World. And as I'll talk about, basically, he brought smallpox, measles, salmonella, and other diseases that decimated the population of the Western Hemisphere. And that resulted in a drastic drop in wildfire as all the Native Americans disappeared. And that's been supplemented in modern times by our industrial society that adds industrial combustion to the picture. So the history of fire and thinking about the state of California, we can't think about fire and natural ecosystems without recognizing that Native Americans have been using fire to manage the landscape and change it. So it's a fire adapted landscape here in California that we live on. So humans kind of, it's sort of a long history. This is a timeline, say, from about 2 million years ago up to the present. There's always been natural wildfires caused by lightning. Some point along the way, the archaeological record suggests around 1 million years ago, early humans began to use opportunistic fire. They would, if there was a natural fire caused by lightning strikes, they recognized that it cooked animals, made food more palatable. They realized it opened up the landscape. So people started to use fire opportunistically. Then they probably managed to keep fire going once they had captured it by conserving it and maintaining it at a given location. The real key was sometime in human history, somebody figured out how to kindle fire, which really made fire really part of the human tool set. So it's interesting, I in my class and on the Earth's history, I have a whole lecture on the importance of fire to human biology. But right now, as humans, we have such a big brain, we take so much energy per unit mass that we simply wouldn't be able to eat enough food per day if it was raw to sustain us. And so anthropologists know of no society on Earth that can live without cooking food. Cooking food gave us the opportunity to get more energy out of meat, out of vegetables, and basically eat it faster. So we were able to consume food fast enough to keep up with the evolution of our really big brain that we now have today. So I really like, I'm going to recommend, this is sort of an aside here, but if you want to think about how it's hard for us in modern industrial society to think about how important fire is. And this is a movie that came out in the mid 80s. It's called A Quest for Fire, starring Ron Perlman up here he played a Neanderthal in the movie. But it shows like around 50,000 years ago, how important fire was to early human groups. And it's sort of a tale between a group that doesn't know how to kindle fire, which Ron Perlman is from, and a group of Homo sapiens that knew how to kindle fire and how they interchanged and learned from each other and passed that information on to the next generation, to subsequent generations. So if you want to step back and sort of 50 to 100,000 years in time and think about how fundamental fire was to just living and surviving, I really recommend this movie, Quest for Fire. But as a result of people learning how to manage fire, the world we live in prior to, well, at least the Western Hemisphere, prior to Columbian contact, was burned very, very frequently. So this is a map of the continental United States, shows the different ecosystem types, and this is the frequency that it was burned. So basically, most of the continental US was burned every 10 to 100 years. Only the wet forests up here in the Northwest were burned maybe on 500-year or 1,000-year time scales. So Native Americans, along with lightning, constantly were creating fires that swept through areas of the US, and like the Great Plains here, virtually every 10 years, all of the tallgrass prairie was burned as a result of both natural and human sorts of activities. One of the interesting thing is when the first English explorers arrived here on the coast of the eastern US, the first thing that greeted them was a haze of smoke over the horizon as a result of the Native Americans using fire not only for cooking and fuel, but also burning the landscape for management of various types as well. So fire was a predominant tool that that sort of that created the so-called natural mosaic of vegetation in the United States. There's a really interesting book that I'd recommend if you want to sort of understand really how anthropogenic the New World was when Columbus and the English arrived. It's called 1491. It was written in the early 2000s by the writer Charles Mann. And he points out that basically the New World was heavily manipulated and managed by people, including the Amazon. Today, it's only in the last 20 years that archaeologists have realized that the Amazon jungle and forest that we see today is a post-Columbian artifact of regrowth after the Native Americans were decimated by disease. They had largely, in many areas, managed and domesticated much of the Amazon jungle through the use of fire and other technology. So one of the ways scientists know about fire history on the planet is through air bubbles trapped in ice in Greenland and Antarctica. So what climate scientists do, both in the US, Europe, and Russia, they've got massive drilling programs, both in Greenland and Antarctica. They take a drill and they drill out these long cores. They're probably now, some of the deepest cores are probably 1.5 miles deep. And then they extract the cores, they cut them in segments, things that they can date in here, so they know we have a very precise information on the gaseous composition of the Earth's atmosphere now for over 600,000 years. And this is from a science paper that was published this year looking at acetylene. Acetylene is a gas that until we developed automobiles and other things only largely came from wildfires. And this is the acetylene concentration in Greenland ice sheet, and this is the Antarctic ice sheet. It was basically increasing until around 1500, and then both areas suffered a plummet in acetylene in the atmosphere, and then sort of a post-industrial revolution increase. And largely this corresponds again to the Columbian contact with the New World and the spread of diseases from the Spanish to the Native American populations. To show how decimating these diseases were, this is the estimated population of the present country of Mexico from 1500 up to 1800. When Columbus arrived, it's estimated that Mexico had 22 million people. In 1520, it was reduced by 8 million people due to a smallpox plague. And then there was a disease, it's a group of unknown diseases called, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Coccolitsli. It's basically salmonella and other diseases that killed off 12 to 15 million people over a decade or so, up to 1550. And then the population was dropped down to around 2 million people. These are basically the survivors of the Native American population that lived there. And so their reduction in population basically drastically reduced wildfire burning down to relatively low levels. So this sort of leads us to California, where we're, all of us are living through what seems to be an enormous increase in wildfire. And again, my colleague Scott Stevens and some other professors and students at Cal wrote a paper a few years ago where they went through the archaeological record, went through tree ring records and other things to put together the prehistoric fire history of California. And Scott estimated that pre-Columbian contact, Native Americans, along with lightning, burned 1 million acres of California each year. And to put this into perspective, it's only in 2020, 2018 that wildfire coverage in California has sort of approached this level. And we're coming back, as I'll talk about, from years of fire suppression. And so now uncontrolled wildfires and unanticipated wildfires are sort of reaching the level that the Native Americans routinely burned each year prior to Columbian contact. In pre-Columbian times, skies were routinely smoky in the summer and fall. So ironically, in the last few years, we've sort of achieved what the Native Americans deliberately experienced, I guess, each year, the smoke and haze in the summer of California. So what Scott is recommending, and fire experts are recommending, is to add fire back in big ways to the management of the forests of California. Forests, of course, are divided up into federal forests managed by the USDA and California forests. California forests, due to efforts by Scott and other people, are probably managed a little better than the federal forest. And as Scott points out, federal forests spend about $1 billion a year in fire suppression. And what he suggests is trying to readapt fire as a management tool to reduce the need and activity in fire suppression and put efforts back into fire management as a way to regain sort of a harmony with the landscape that we're living in. So how do people impact fire and fire frequency? So basically, my friend or my colleague Max Moritz at Santa Barbara points out that when a wildfire starts at the time scale of seconds and on sort of the scale of meters to kilometers, basically somebody or somehow there's a heat added to the scene, basically lightning or human sparks or fires that ignite fuel, get it going, and then the fire takes off. And then the rate it advances and how big it gets depends on topography, the amount of fuel present, and then the local weather conditions. But on decades to longer time scales, it's not only the number of ignitions, both natural and human-made, but it's how basically we are as a human species affecting vegetation density and climate. So we're having a role now in sort of managing or causing fire frequency through building up fuel through basically a century or more of fire suppression. And then also we're in the midst of a vast climate changing episode right now that people in sort of the national defense industry call a threat multiplier. It's one of the contributing components to a vast array of other things that lead to increased fire frequency. So one of the things, this is just a local example right in Fred and my neighborhood of how fire suppression has changed the fuel load. So we live in Orinda, just over the hill from Berkeley. This is probably right now downtown Orinda. Fred and I live probably up here in these hills behind this area right here. This is what our hill slope looks like today. Basically, a century from the early 20th century up to today, trees have regrown uh, uh, bay trees, oaks, shrubs, all sorts of things. This is sort of the Irind of landscape, a lot less fuel load than exists here today. The other thing is California is getting hotter, and on the average, rainfall is sort of going to be constant, but climate scientists, just based on observations and on projections, it's going to become more irregular. We're going to have periods of enormous rainfalls, punctuated by a few years of really low rainfalls. Averaging it out, it's going to look the same, but it's going to become much more irregular. And also because of warming and the, the longer growth season, the length of the fire season is increasing. So some scientists from a consortium of universities around California published a paper this year, I'll back up, showing basically for the months of September, October, and November, basically the tail end of the growing season, of the fire season, there's been showing that the temperature of this fire season has been increasing steadily since 1980. Rainfall is very, very irregular, but the fire susceptibility index is slowly and irregularly climbing, and the number of acres burned is slowly and erratically increasing as well. So again, climate change is an added feature on top of all the fuel that's accumulated as a result of fire suppression over the last century. So I want to sort of just amplify how important and how big climate change really is in California, and especially Southern California, the desert, and the Los Angeles basin. So I'm doing a project just across the California border in Clark County, Nevada. And this is just from the US weather records for a number of cities in Clark County: Searchlight, Nevada, Las Vegas, Boulder City, and Bullhead City. This is the temperature, mean annual temperature from 1960 up until 2019. The temperatures of all these cities and communities and little towns has increased between 1.5 and 4 degrees centigrade. And to put this into more common metrics, 2 degrees centigrade is just about 3.5 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So many of these communities in Nevada and also in the Mojave Desert and in Southern California have increased 3 to more than 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 60 years. Also, because of that, it's getting more it's getting drier. Even though the rainfall is relatively constant, the evaporation rate, so this is the evaporation rate for Boulder City, Nevada, from 1960 to 71. Basically in the winter it was very low, in the summer it was about 0.75 inches per day. And this is from 1990 up until 2000. So in the winter, again, it's low, but in the summer it's over an inch a day. So basically it's drying the desert out and drying out the regions of Southern California. So the fire season and the potential for fire is growing, in addition to the high fuel loads that are already present out there. So again, climate change is something that's sort of being, in the last 4 decades, being added on top of other factors that are contributing to fire. And so national defense people, as I mentioned, call it a multiplier effect. And my colleagues Scott and Max and everybody else argue or suggest that it just has to be part of a comprehensive approach, not only to statewide fire management, but to national and international approaches to fire management. So this is a really, I found a great video produced by NBC News in Los Angeles showing the increase in wildfires in California from 1910 up until 2019. And I'll play this video for you and point out a few things for you while we're watching it. So 1910 was right before fire suppression started, and the average fire size per year was in the 100 to 200,000 acres per year range. And this shows each year where fires are located. And then the orange sort of sums up the fire over the century. The first big fire occurred in 1932. It's the Matilda fire, 200,000 acres. And we're going up into 1948, 50. Now the fires become on the 500,000 acre size frame, getting 500,000 acres up in that area. Some years it's very low, some years it's higher. 1970, the Laguna fire comes in, the 8th largest fire. Getting in the 70s, the Marble Cone fire comes in. Fire size is routinely over 300,000 acres or more per year. Now we get into 800,000 acres in the 90s, 600,000, we're getting in the 2000s, 900,000 acre fires become more common. And even now we're over 1 million in 2007, 2008, 2012, 500,000. And then 17, 18, over a 1.5 million acres, and then 2019. But if I remember correctly, Governor Newsom said, I think we had 3 of the largest wildfires in history that burned this year. So we can add 3 more mega fires or top 10 fires to that list due to what happened here in 2020. So this is kind of a short talk. I want to have some Q&A and discussion at this. But what do we do? So Scott has spent not only a lot of time looking at the history of fires, but a big part of his effort is to create policy and management tools that can be used to reduce the severity and magnitude and the devastation caused by wildfires. And so Scott recommends, and along with his colleagues, that it falls on the shoulders of all people in California, landowners, especially people in fire-prone areas. I guess that includes Fred, Goff, and myself, should follow FireWise guidelines. We need to reduce the fuel load around our houses. I know Maria and I have just spent $10,000 this fall reducing our fire load. I don't think we're at the point we should be. And of course, our neighbors have enormous amount of fuel around us as well. But we all have to view this very explicitly and as landowners deal with fire management. And then there's the state and federal folks that have to develop new approaches to fire, basically switch away from fire suppression to more informed fire management. And also, as Scott says, we shouldn't allow vast acreages, especially in upland forests, to burn, because it removes basically small areas that allow areas for regrowth and the spread of new seeds and so forth. So less uniform fire and basically more heterogeneous fires would help the landscape recover from fires. And then Scott points out down here that not all forests are the same. Some forests, like Ponderosa pine, have adapted to high frequency, low intensity fires. Some forests, like lodgepole in Colorado and places like that, can withstand high severity, low frequency fires. So basically management has to be forest specific. It can't be one sort of management fits all. Now, Fred and I kind of are fortunate. We live in Orinda, which has undertaken a pretty significant wildfire management regime. And so I'm going to show you this little news clip from KTVU that was done a few years ago about Orinda's approach to wildfire management, and then I'll sort of end after that.
Prevent and battle wildfires in the East Bay. It essentially combines old-fashioned brush clearing and new technology, and it could potentially become a model for the country. KTVU's Tom Vakar is in Orinda tonight, which is the center of a much larger effort to tame wildfires, Tom, before they explode.
You got to take a look at this. This is part of that new technology that we're talking about, a sensor that we'll refer to in just a minute, because this historically fire-critical part of Contra Costa County is now well under its way in an effort to avoid the worst from happening. The Moraga Orinda Fire District, CAL FIRE, Contra Costa Fire, East Bay Mud, East Bay Parks, and others are clearing grass and brush along a 17-mile known fire corridor to prevent wildfires. With 4 miles already done, the Orinda Shaded Fuel Break will slow down the speed and spread of any fire on the ground while keeping it out of the crowns of the trees above.
We've reduced its spread rate, we've reduced the fire line intensity, and we set the stage to buy time to execute an orderly and effective evacuation.
But 2 Orinda elementary schools with very limited road access would take too long to evacuate. The solution? Shelter in place.
We're going to need every gallon we can get our hands on.
The safety and security of our students is our #1 priority.
Since both schools live in the historical path of other wildfires, what was decided was that the district would fund 2 10,000-gallon tanks, one at each of the schools. The idea being that the fire truck hooks up, defends a building that the kids are in, and nobody gets hurt.
What that gives us is a reliable known water site that's dedicated for firefighting.
Arrayed around the schools, a network of remote fire detection sensors tell firefighters danger is near virtually instantaneously. A San Francisco company named Splunk receives data not only from these field sensors, but a vast array of other sources, from satellites in space, drones in the air, crews on the ground, weather stations, road conditions, and social media. The more sources, the better.
The data that is available today fundamentally enables us to reimagine the whole process of detecting, managing, and recovering from fires.
Responders and people in the area will then get real-time information in an easy but complete form tailored to their needs.
The deeper we get into this, the greater potential for avoiding loss of life, reducing loss of property, and preserving critical natural resources.
Because obviously the children are our most precious resource, and we want to be able to keep them safe.
Now, when the district's insurer saw what the school district had done, it got a $10,000 rebate back on the $65,000 that the district spent on those water tanks. That's proof that investing in fire prevention really pays off, especially in an area where a lot of homeowners are being outright canceled on their fire insurance policies. Back live, the sensor sits there and just waits to see if something happens. Reporting live, Tom Bakar, KTVU Fox 2 News.
Tom, thank you.
So Fred and I, again, they were talking about this fire corridor. That video was done a few years ago. We're right now apparently at 103% completion. So Orinda has this northern boundary in Lafayette around it that hopefully will help reduce the spread of any wildfire coming from the north or northeast, moving down towards Orinda and Moraga and other communities. So I want to basically end there and just have time for any of you to ask questions and have discussion about this and anything that I talked about in the presentation.
Do you have any information about the East Bay Hills?
Well, Scott, I don't have specific information on that, but Scott has been involved, especially in Berkeley, around the Berkeley campus and campus properties about cutting. I think he was involved in that first swath of cutting down eucalyptus along Grizzly Peak about a decade or 15 years ago. I know he's been frustrated dealing with Berkeley, a handful of Berkeley citizens that view eucalyptus as natural resources or view them mystically and have been preventing clearing of eucalyptus. But he's been behind, along with other folks on campus, the reduction in fire load around Lawrence National Lab and other places as well. So I don't have a specific, I don't know the underlying plan that's involved there, but I know Scott is engaged and other people engaged in a East Bay Hills sort of approach as well.
Good.
So it seems like clearing load is something that would be extremely hard to do without fire. And I wonder, you know, and I guess our population, you know, controlled fires are hard to get permission for because the neighbors get, you know, grumpy about it. But then also there is the danger of fire getting out of control. So I don't know if there's, it seems like a really difficult problem to handle fire load when there are so many people and structures nearby.
That's right. So Scott, I mean, in general, using prescribed fire to reduce fire load, Scott pointed, I mean, I've read a couple of his papers and he pointed out that there's public opposition to this because of smoke, although he pointed out that the catastrophic fires produce smoke and other things that far exceed anything that would be produced by prescribed fire. In Orinda, Fred might be aware of this. They cleared that corridor, and last year I know that there were a number of small prescribed fires that sort of reduced or cleared out the underbrush underneath that as well. So somehow they were able to pull that off without, I didn't see a lot of smoke come from it, but it was only when I drove by that I could smell the fire that had burned there previously. So they are using prescribed fire, at least on our Orinda fire break and our Lafayette fire break.
Ron, I started recording just after you introduced the two guys that you were referring to mostly. Can you just review that one more time?
Sure. So Scott Stevens is a professor of wildland fire management. He's got his background in civil engineering and forestry, but he's been here for almost 20 years, and he's sort of the state's, one of the international leaders actually in wildfire management. And then Max Moritz is down at UC Santa Barbara, and he's in the UC Cooperative Extension branch and deals more with public outreach and working with communities and educating the public on wildfire and wildfire management. So we have a really strong team, as you might hope for here in California. But as you know, I guess reading what some of the things that Scott wrote yesterday, it's still translating this scientific knowledge into public policy is always the hardest step in environmental problems. And the scope of the problem now, because of fire suppression for so long, is challenging, and to bring fire back routinely into a way of managing our fire adapted landscape is going to take, you know, public acceptance and political willpower to do that, I think.
You know, there's a little sub story in clearing both my land and my neighbor's land, actually 7 neighbors' lands. I worked on hiring Guatemalan refugees who had been put out by the COVID, and the fire department that inspected afterwards says that those 2 lots are exemplary models of what should be done. And I thought that was kind of an ironic little twist to the whole, you know.
The indigenous people know what they're doing.
Yeah. And did a great job. And also Orinda had a program, the fire department, of one of the big things in clearing land is what do you do with what you clear? And they said, if you stack all this brush with the stubs out pointing towards the street, we will come by and chip it free. So we did 5 huge loads, and they chip it back onto your land, so they don't have to haul it away.
Great.
So that was huge. I mean, the last 8 months, that's a lot of what I've been. The last 6 months.
I'm just recovering from a 2-week bout of poison oak from brush clearing.
Yeah. Yeah. Question, you talk about the eucalyptus, and now, I've loved the eucalyptus here. I've loved it. I grew up with eucalyptus on the, lots of eucalyptus trees, even learned to climb the dang things. But they really are a fire hazard. They're like little candles out there waiting to be explode, aren't they? And they really should be cleared if we want to do this.
Well-
Ron, I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of uniform policy governing regional park systems? Is that the state?
I don't know. I think the regional park system isn't state run. It's a local, I think it's Fred might know, it's a local consortium of groups that manage it, but I don't know what their fire, and I haven't had time to look up what their fire plan might be.
Well, if you voted, you probably voted for somebody for director of regional parks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did, actually.
You know,
My daughter works with them, actually.
another thing that Arinda benefited from is our fire chief. And his name is David Whitaker. He was in this video. And he's a veteran. I forget whether he's a Marine or something from the Afghan war. And he treats this as a war zone and is mobilizing everybody as if it were a war. He's held over 60 house meetings in Arinda. And he happens to be, I went up to him one time because Glenda told me that her family was a good friend of him. And he said, oh yeah, the Pawsies, they're like my second family. And so I always think of him of what he's been able to do in Arinda. And the fear in Arinda is that the state is going to hire him away, or Washington will hire him away. But he's been a real godsend.
So Ron, can you talk a little bit about political rhetoric in how we, as maybe progressive people who acknowledge or recognize a concern for climate change, can kind of hold ourselves to a reasonable and wise point of view?
Well,
watch his video.
Well, yeah, I think, Max, I guess just simply looking at the data, the increasing temperatures, increasing evaporation rates, it's clear even to anybody that's willing to accept data that California is drying and warming up, and the fire season is increasing, which is not, I don't know which, I would say the fire load is the underlying problem, and then you overlay the longer fire season on top of it that is consistent with greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's just simply something that has to be dealt with. I mean, we can't ignore it, and it's very rational to put these two together and realize that they're both working in synergy. I guess it's to take Fred's point of view, this young guy, our fire chief, in the military arena, generals consistently acting generals view climate change as a threat multiplier to social disturbance, political disturbance, their bases and their facilities. They take this as a given, and I don't know where they stand. A lot of generals might be Republicans at heart, but they're certainly universally cognizant of climate change as a threat problem and want to deal with it in a way that's appropriate so that they can be successful in what they do. And so we have to view fire, I think, in the same way. I think Fred pointing out that we have a guy that's viewing this as a war issue, hopefully he would view this in a similar way, that climate change, on top of this giant fuel load we have around here, is a multiplier effect on top of everything else.
Is is this managed all locally? I mean, does the city council of Orinda, is it solely responsible for fire management, or is there an authority that's exercised above that? I'm thinking that maybe the Oakland City Council is somehow, the Oakland Fire Department is responsible for the East Bay Hills, Berkeley Fire Department. Is there any agency above it that's looking at this and prescribing solutions?
Well, Bob, I have to say I just don't know, but I know we have, as I mentioned in that video, what's going on in Rinda is a team effort by a number of agencies. CAL FIRE, which is a state agency contending with wildfires, and they listed a few others, including Orinda. And Fred might be able, because he's talked to the fire chief, know a little bit more about the local. I suppose there's local communities that have joined together on this fire break that extends through Lafayette towards Walnut Creek.
Yep. And you know, there's another big factor that wasn't mentioned in your thing. Is, well, no, you mentioned it in passing, and that is the insurance industry. And many people in Orinda have lost their home insurance because of the fire danger. And it's a big, big motivator. I think the state of California put a moratorium on canceling policies for 1 year after a big fire. And I think that 1 year ended in November. So there may be a whole new wave of cancellations, but I'd say the insurance industry is playing a very big role, not necessarily a helpful role, but it's a big factor to take into account. The other is, I know that this fire break to the north of us is a big multi-agency project and is, like you said, coordinated through with CAL FIRE's assistance. And I know that Carl Williams, I don't know if he's on, but he's working with a similar program up in the hills in Berkeley in his own neighborhood that I think neighbors, maybe with the assistance of the city of Berkeley, are doing.
I mean, is it essentially regarded as a local problem rather than as a regional or statewide, or, I mean, who has authority to make plans and implement them?
I think,
Why
go
don't
ahead.
you- yeah, go Carl.
Yeah, I can say something about the East Bay Regional Parks. They have a fuel reduction plan that's about 10 years old. And they have divided up, they have like recommended treatment areas that are RTAs. And like Tilden, for instance, has a few, and they've started reducing fuel loads, and they're promoting this shaded fuel break concept. But they really have limited funds. So they're areas near our house, and we live near Tilden Park, that haven't been touched yet. And then other ones they've been able to do a lot of work with. So, and then we've done some work with the Diablo Fire Safe Council, and they work with the regional parks and neighbors to reduce fuel loads in the park. And we were able to get we got permission a few years ago to go into Tilden right next to Berkeley and cut brush and remove a few eucalyptus trees. But it takes a lot of work and coordination to do that. So
Yeah,
I could probably share a little bit too. I for like the last, until this year, this is the first year I haven't been directly in charge of fire response, but for the last about 5 years, I've been in charge of fire response from a telecommunications perspective. And so I have like team members that are in the fire chiefs meetings in pretty much every meeting, and also deal with like CAL FIRE and the different agencies. And there really is no, like CAL FIRE does run the state, but it's a partnership with all the local municipalities, and it's a very cooperative arrangement. There has been some political tension in the last while from the national agency wanting to come in and take over sort of CAL FIRE and sort of run the show, and manage things from a national perspective. There's actually been like funding, I believe, that's probably been taken from CAL FIRE, and so they're providing less information and less resources to the community than they have in the past. And I think so there's been that little battle that's been going on. But I can tell you, just I've had a great deal of experience in working with CAL FIRE and the municipalities. And it really comes down to funding. They're very competent. They're very, just brave, competent people who are working for the community. But they do have a lack of funding, and there's a lack of attention because of all this, this tension between, not in my neighborhood. I don't want that prescribed fire. I don't want to pay the expense to go in and clear out my favorite trees. Or the ground level. So it really needs to be a groundswell that the politicians will respond to act to support fire suppression. And Ron, I was sort of curious how much you felt that the balance between prescribed fires versus managing the brush. If how much what percentage of the plan is could landowners manage their brush and their undergrowth versus how much do we need to do like either prescribed or allow, like the one over 1,000,000+ acre fire that they let burn in this east of San Jose area, purely I think for fire conservation for the future. What's your thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm have a background deep enough to comment on this. I think the one thing that strikes me watching the fuel reduction going on around our neighborhood, both last year PG&E came through to cut down trees around the utility lines, and then up on Grizzly Peak, they're clearing out eucalyptus and things like that. But it's the amount of work and labor involved just to make a dent in all the eucalyptus trees is staggering. And I totally appreciate the statement that there's an underfunding for all this because of the enormity of the problem. It's just inadvertently built up over a century. And then here we are trying to come to grips with this now, especially since we're back at pre-Columbian levels of fire, which aren't burning maybe in the ways that the Native Americans did it. And we're trying to save houses and stuff. It's a challenge to clear up 100 years of fire suppression and fire mismanagement in a very short time. It's a staggering problem.
When I was a kid up in Vallejo, we used to have the neighbors to get together. We were on the edge of the grasslands just north of the high school, and it went for miles out there with grass, and there was grass on the high school property even, and the neighbors got together in the winter and burned off the grass, wait for the right wind and the right weather, and you'd have all the kids out there. It was great fun in wet burlap sacks and go whack at the grass. And it was a neighborhood thing. I think at the beginning, the fire department was maybe notified, and this was in the 40s. In the 50s, they required permits to have even a fire in your backyard to burn trash, whereas in the 40s they didn't. And then they kept getting stricter and stricter until those burns just all went away. Of course, the whole area got covered with houses in the 50s. So up in Lake County, where my uncle was near Cobb, um, they used to burn in the 40s. They knew that the Indians used to burn, not too many years before. Local Indians
Mhm.
were still in the area. Um, and I don't know, I don't ever remember seeing a fire truck up there during a local burn. I think ranchers just burned off their own grasslands when they needed to.
Thanks, Don. I remember I was really young, but helping beat back a fire with a wet burlap sack.
Yeah.
That
You
was
know, Ron, do you know the name Tanya, who used to be the fire marshal at UC Berkeley, and then went on to be, I think, the county, and now she's in Sacramento. She might know a lot of the history, but I remember she told me many years ago her biggest job at UC in protecting UC Berkeley and developing a plan for managing a big fire was how to get the 20 or 30 hyenas that were in the research facility up above the math building, how to get them out of there. I always thought that.
hyenas.
So we're about an hour over, an hour in. So this is fascinating, Ron. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
Fantastic, Ron. Thank you.
Great presentation. I'm really glad it was recorded.
Yes.
Yeah. Hopefully I did it well enough. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this amazing creation. And sometimes we forget how long it has been around. And so it is just a wonder to see all that has gone on and all the people from all places that have lived on this planet. We pray that you would guide us and our leaders and our government and our firefighters, and that we would be good stewards of this creation that you have placed us in. We thank you for Ron and his wonderful ministry with us and at the university, and pray that you would just bless the scholars there, that they can do the good work, and somehow or another we pray that the translation of science into policy might be efficient and beneficial. And all of this we lift up by the grace of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron.